How does a proud Muslim country somehow come to fear Muslims themselves? Imagine building magnificent mosques, sponsoring Islamic scholars, and presenting yourself as a champion of moderate Islam, while simultaneously funding wars against Muslim populations and media campaigns that fuel Islamophobia in the West. Today, we are diving deep into the curious case of the United Arab Emirates, a country that has become a profound contradiction, leaving Muslims around the world not only perplexed, but disturbed, angered, and increasingly betrayed. This video is not an attack on the Emirati people, nor is it an argument against development, technology, prosperity, religious coexistence, or peace between Muslims and people of other faiths. It is an examination of the worldview that now shapes the Emirati state, one that is physically independent, materially powerful, and internationally influential, yet remains thoroughly intellectually colonized. This is not because a European governor still rules the Emirates, nor because the UAE lacks sovereignty. Quite the opposite. Its colonization is epistemic. It has internalized the colonial conception of Islam and the Muslim human being without even realizing it. Although many modern Muslim states were shaped by borders and political systems imposed by colonial powers, Muslims, including Emiratis, are rarely taught how those powers viewed, controlled, and dehumanized Muslim societies. Without understanding that history, they cannot recognize how deeply those same ideas still shape their views of Islam, progress, power, and even themselves. For example, the colonial view of the Muslim was never merely that he followed a different religion. It was that he lacked political maturity. He was considered too emotional to govern rationally, too attached to religion to become a modern citizen, too loyal to their Muslim brothers and sisters to be trusted by the territorial state, and too vulnerable to fanaticism to be allowed genuine political autonomy. To put it plainly, a Muslim, in the eyes of the colonial administration, could not simply be recognized as an adult political subject. He had to be studied, classified, educated, modernized, or to put it plainly, supervised. And whenever colonial authorities considered it necessary, Muslims had to be controlled. However, colonialism was presented such that this control was a civilizing responsibility, a type of favor on those that could not organize themselves. The colonized Muslim was not being dominated, according to the colonial story. He was being protected from himself. That assumption survived long after colonial rule formally ended. It remained embedded in education, law, security institutions, and the modern nation-state itself, even when no longer stated openly. Eventually, many Muslim ruling elites internalized it and began applying it to their own people. This reality remains almost invisible to these elites because many of them sincerely believe in Islam. They pray, fast, build mosques, sponsor Quran competitions, and host religious conferences, yet they still cannot imagine the Muslim as an independent maker of civilization. And that is the heart of the problem. They can imagine Islam as faith, architecture, personal morality, or cultural heritage. What they cannot imagine is Islam as an independent source of public morality, justice, and social order. Like the colonial administrations before them, they have internalized the belief that Islam belongs to the past and cannot help shape the modern world. But the question is why? The answer comes down to two forces, crippling not only the United Arab Emirates, but Muslims across the world: civilizational amnesia and materialism. In today's UAE, being visibly Muslim is easy. Perform your rituals, attend the mosque, dress visibly as a Muslim, fast, pray, give charity, and enjoy the comforts of life. This is the state-approved Islamic worldview of the 21st century. But there is one red line. You cannot become an independent moral agent. Your moral judgment must end where the authority of the state begins. You may practice Islam, but you may not use Islam to judge power. You are bound by the morality of the state. But what is the problem? For many Muslims, this seems like a reasonable bargain. They retain their rituals, identity, and personal piety while surrendering public morality to the state. They accept supervision and gradually come to see authoritarian control, not as a loss of freedom, but as protection from disorder. In exchange for stability, they relinquish their moral agency and trust the state to decide what is right. This is precisely where civilizational amnesia reveals itself. Muslims cannot seem to remember how morality actually functions within a society, especially an Islamic one. They have somehow forgotten that morality cannot be sustained through sermons, private sincerity, hijabs, beards, or religious symbolism alone. It requires a degree of institutional freedom, such as independent courts, scholars, endowments, professional bodies, and communal institutions capable of translating moral principles into accountability and real consequences. Without these structures, morality may remain symbolically visible but powerless in action. But if that's the case, why has this amnesia taken such a deep hold across the Muslim world? If Muslims truly once possessed the institutions and mechanisms needed to build a moral society, why have they been unable to recover that civilizational vision? The answer to this affects Muslims everywhere, and it has shaped the Emirati worldview with particular force. One of the most important forces sustaining this amnesia has been Salafi-Wahhabism, an ideology that has taken root in the heartland of Islam's holiest sites, and that was later exported globally. It did far more than challenge particular beliefs or devotional practices. Its deeper effect was to delegitimize the historical institutions through which Islamic morality had been cultivated, transmitted, and enforced. Unlike today, pre-modern Islamic societies did not merely function through sermons and personal piety alone. Its moral life was sustained by high-quality jurists, Sufi orders, waqfs, guilds, local customs, scholarly lineages, and communal authorities. These institutions formed character, regulated conduct, and preserved centers of moral authority beyond the direct control of the ruler. Salafi-Wahhabism advanced an argument that was historically anachronistic and intellectually reductive, yet deeply persuasive to ordinary Muslims. Return directly to the Salaf, the pious predecessors, and treat the first 3 generations as the final measure of religious purity. This gradually cast suspicion on almost everything Muslims had developed afterward. Centuries of intellectual, scientific, artistic, and institutional achievement were no longer understood as Islam's evolving response to changing human conditions. They could instead be dismissed as unnecessary additions, corruptions, or even deviant innovations. The irony is profound. A vast intellectual heritage that helped nourish Europe's own development was now being treated by Muslims themselves as something suspect. Islamic history ceased to appear as a living civilizational journey and was recast as a long decline away from an imagined original purity. This gradually alienated generations of Muslims from their own civilizational heritage. But the question is, why does any of this even matter? Can't Muslims survive with the Quran and Sunnah alone? Isn't that all Muslims need to preserve themselves? The reality is the Quran and Sunnah provide the foundation. But that's not the same as a civilization. When Muslims abandoned their accumulated intellectual and cultural heritage, they lost the tools through which societies understand themselves and respond creatively to a rapidly changing, modern and multifaceted world. It is almost impossible for a people to live on legal rulings and ritual instructions alone. They need stories that explain who they are, art that expresses what they love, philosophy that helps them confront new questions, and historical memory that prevents every generation from starting again from nothing. Once all this accumulated heritage was delegitimized, Islam became relatively easy to deconstruct towards a narrow set of visible obligations: correct belief, ritual performance, dress, prohibition, and personal compliance. What disappeared was the civilizational world that made morality operative. A sermon could condemn dishonesty, but there was no independent institution capable of disciplining the dishonest merchant. A scholar could speak all day about justice, but he possessed no autonomous office capable of restraining the ruler. A mosque could teach generosity for hours, while the Awqaf and communal networks that once transformed generosity into durable public institutions had been weakened or absorbed by the state. The result was an institutional vacuum. Colonial powers had already dismantled much of the inherited religious and social order. Salafi-Wahhabism then delegitimized what remained, convincing Muslims that these institutions were merely innovations and therefore unnecessary. With no independent structure left to organize religious life, the state stepped in. Scholars became employees, mosques became supervised spaces, religious education was standardized, moral authority no longer emerged from learning, communal trust or institutional independence. It now flowed downward from the government. And this is not even the end. Within the broader Salafi-Wahhabi current emerged Madkhalism, which drove the political logic of obedience to its final conclusion. Salafi-Wahhabism had already severed Muslims from much of their intellectual and institutional heritage. Madkhalism then placed the final nail in the coffin of moral agency by making obedience to the ruler the believer's central political duty. But how is Madkhalism different from politically quietist Sufis? Do both not end up leaving the ruler alone? A politically quietist Sufi may choose silence, and that silence can certainly benefit the state. Yet the tradition may still preserve spiritual lineages, inherited scholarship, sacred art, community life, and forms of moral authority that do not originate in government. In Madkhali thought, as in Salafi-Wahhabism, much of the inherited Islamic tradition is dismissed as innovation, while obedience to the ruler is treated as a religious duty, even when the ruler is openly unjust. Its scholars repeatedly call Muslims back to the Salaf, yet offer little vision for how to build law, education, art, economics, charity, or public life in a complex modern society. This has become part of the intellectual world many Emiratis inherit. They are told to return to the beginning, while being cut off from the accumulated wisdom needed to move forward. Left trapped between a past they no longer understand and a future they cannot build, they begin searching elsewhere for meaning and progress. Into that vacuum enters materialism. Colonialism dismantled the institutions that once made Islamic morality socially effective. Salafi-Wahhabism taught Muslims to distrust much of the civilization those institutions had produced, and Madkhalism then taught them to surrender moral and political judgment to the ruler. The stage was set. Materialism merely filled what remained. Progress was no longer measured by justice, knowledge, character, or service, but by GDP, wealth, technology, comfort, and visible development. Skyscrapers, airports, security and consumption became proof that the system was successful, and therefore legitimate. The bargain was simple. The state would provide prosperity and stability, while citizens surrendered moral and political agency. Islam could remain as ritual, identity, and architecture, but it would no longer define the direction of society. Islam provided legitimacy, materialism provided aspiration, and Madkhalism supplied obedience. We are now approaching the culmination of a perfect storm. Imagine the worldview taking shape within the Emirati state. You have inherited the colonial belief that Muslims cannot truly govern themselves. You have embraced materialism, which measures success through wealth, technology, security, and visible power. Decades of intense Islamophobia accelerates the process. Through well-funded campaigns across Hollywood, news media, publishing, and political messaging, terrorism is amplified and exploited to repeatedly portray Muslims as irrational, unstable, violent, and easily radicalized. Islam is tolerated as ritual and heritage, but feared whenever it becomes political, independent, or civilizational. Within this worldview, the Emirati state no longer acts as though it is merely governing Muslims. It begins to act as though it is protecting society from what Muslims might become if they were ever left politically free. This produces a powerful yet strange sense of guardianship. The Emirati state begins to imagine itself as perhaps the only mature and rational actor in the region. Islamic populations are viewed as religious, yet emotional and increasingly vulnerable to manipulation. Their freedom is now a risk. By extension, independent organizations in the West also become suspicious. Any sort of political expression of Islam in this worldview is seen as a disease that must be contained before it spreads. Within this paradigm, the Muslim Brotherhood naturally appears as an existential threat, not simply because of its ideology or failures, but because it represents Muslims organizing outside an authoritarian ruler's control. It creates schools, charities, networks, and political movements. It suggests that ordinary Muslims can become agents rather than subjects. Then came the Arab uprisings. Millions entered the streets, removed rulers, and demanded the right to shape their own societies. The uprisings deeply alarmed the Emirati state. To a decolonized mind, this might have appeared as a painful and imperfect struggle toward political adulthood. But to the Emirati worldview, the disorder that followed seemed to confirm the original colonial assumption: give Muslims freedom, and they will produce Islamism, instability, and chaos. From there, foreign policy followed almost inevitably. If Muslim populations could not be trusted to choose their own future, then their countries had to be managed. Reliable generals, rulers, militias, and local proxies could instead govern them on behalf of stability. The same logic once used by colonial powers returned in a new form. Control the population indirectly through intermediaries who depend upon you. This is how the colonized mind moves toward Machiavellianism. First, Muslims are assumed incapable of ruling themselves. Then their political movements are treated as threats. Their uprisings are interpreted as proof of their immaturity. And finally, their countries are controlled through proxies. What made these proxies attractive to the Emiratis was not their legitimacy, but their capacity for control. A strongman, general or militia commander, may be violent, corrupt, or deeply unpopular, but he can still impose effective control on large populations. He can crush opposition, dismantle independent institutions, and prevent any political movements from developing outside the desired order. The devastation is then conveniently reframed as the price of stability, as seen in the UAE's support for Sisi's government in Egypt and Khalifa Haftar's military authority in eastern Libya. Mass arrests become security. Political repression becomes order. Civil war becomes containment. The suffering of entire populations is treated as unfortunate but necessary, because the only alternative offered is chaos, Islamism, or state collapse. This is why authoritarian proxies are so attractive to the Emirati leadership. They do not need to be just. They only need to be effective, dependent, and controllable. Their violence is tolerated because it serves a larger promise, that someone, no matter how brutal, is keeping society under control. This comes directly from the logic of colonial rule. Colonial powers rarely governed every community themselves. They ruled through local chiefs, military officers, and dependent elites who could control the population on their behalf. These intermediaries did not need popular legitimacy or moral credibility. They only needed to remain loyal, suppress resistance, and preserve order. Their brutality was tolerated because colonial power valued control over justice and stability over human life. The same logic now reappears through authoritarian proxies. The strongman does not need to represent the people. He only needs to contain them. His violence becomes acceptable because he promises to prevent the one outcome the system fears most: a population becoming politically independent. And this brings us to Israel and Sudan, where the worldview we have described becomes foreign policy. Israel appears as a natural partner because it represents everything the Emirati model admires: military power, technology, intelligence, Western influence, and a shared hostility toward independent Islamic movements. But what of the Palestinian struggle and its fight for freedom? What about the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Muslim holy sites? Within this worldview, the Palestinian struggle increasingly appears as a lost cause to be managed rather than a just cause to be defended. Intellectually colonized and severed from the moral memory of an Islamic civilization, the Palestinian struggle is no longer seen as resistance to occupation, but as a reckless defiance against an overwhelmingly superior power. Palestinian sacrifice is reframed as self-inflicted destruction. Resistance becomes irrationality. Refusal to surrender becomes extremism. The lesson offered is simple: accept domination, abandon liberation, and call submission peace. Israel is admired because it possesses power, technology, and control, while Palestinians are blamed for refusing to accept the limits imposed upon them. Sudan reveals the same logic through proxies. Multiple investigations have linked UAE-connected supply networks to the RSF, a force accused of mass atrocities and genocide. The UAE denies supporting either side. Within the Emirati framework, its brutality is not necessarily a disqualification. It is precisely what makes the RSF useful. It can seize territory, crush opposition, and impose control without requiring public legitimacy. The result is fully Machiavellian. Israel becomes the strategic partner. The RSF becomes the proxy. Palestinians and Sudanese become populations to be managed. Colonialism taught the Emirati state to distrust Muslim self-rule. Salafi-Wahhabism erased the civilizational memory that showed Muslims could build and govern their own institutions. Madkhalism sanctified submission to power. Materialism reduced progress to wealth, technology, and force. Islamophobia transformed Muslim autonomy from a civilizational possibility into a security threat, and Machiavellian foreign policy turned that fear into alliances, proxies, and domination. The final result is a state that builds mosques while helping destroy Muslim societies, speaks of tolerance while supporting domination, and offers Muslims aid as victims while refusing to imagine them as free political agents. If this video helped you see the deeper problem, please like, share, and follow for more content.